to 15,000. Let's just play nice and say we all kind of average about 10 to 15,000. Now, I will say this, parents, we probably average more because we're always having to stay on our kids, right? And most of your words are the same thing over and over, especially if you're like me and you've got a toddler at home. Don't touch that. Don't do that. Didn't I say don't touch that? Didn't I say don't do that, right? Get down from there. Get your finger out of your nose. Quit sticking your hand in your diaper. I mean, like, did you wipe poo-poo all over your bedroom? Sorry, we're just processing a little bit of personal things here. We'll get back on track now. Or here's another one. We'll just go. Did you poo-poo? And the response is no. Are you lying? No. Or sometimes he's like, yeah. Anyway, so we all average, say, about 10 to 15,000 words a day. Now, think of all the things that have been said to you just over the past maybe hours. How many of you remember the things that were said to you, maybe even in your Sunday school class? How many of you could quote everything that your Sunday school teacher said? And you're like, what Sunday school lesson? What are you talking about? Was I awake? Here's the point of all the things that are said to us over the course of a day, over the course of a week, we don't remember everything, right? And we don't plan, as a parent, I don't plan on my child remembering or memorizing everything that I say to him. Now, there are things I want him to know. Don't touch that. Don't do this. Don't do that. Do this, do that. You know, there are specific things that I want him to know to do and to know not to do, right? That's a good thing. But the fact of the matter is that we can't expect everybody to remember everything that we say. But here's the thing. One of the things that we can probably hang our hat on is that people are going to remember your last words. The last things that you said to them, maybe. Maybe there's something, maybe a family member that said something to you on their deathbed, and that's the one thing that has stuck with you over the course of your entire life. You remember that. You can picture that moment. You can picture everything about that moment, and you remember, right? And here's the thing. Our last words say a lot about who we are. They say a lot about the type of person we were. And so I just Googled famous last words, and I want to read to you some famous last words of some people. Lady Nancy Astor, she was the first woman to be seated in the British Parliament. She died in 1964. She had been sick on and off most of her life, and at her last battle of illness, she woke up one time, and she said, and her whole family is standing around her, and she says this, "Am I dying, or is this my birthday?" A man named Dominic Willard, he was a foot soldier during the Prohibition. He'd been arrested and he faced death by a firing squad. And so they asked him, "Dominic, do you have any last words?" And he says, or any last requests? And he says, "Yes, a bulletproof vest." John Barrymore, an actor, passed away in 1942 in spite of his famous last words because he said this, "Die? I should say not, dear fellow. No Barrymore would allow such a conventional thing to happen." And he died. Karl Marx, noted communist, said this to his housekeeper. She had come into his room and said, "Give me your last words. Tell me what you want the world to remember about you." And this is what he said. "Go on, get out. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough." And so she went and recorded it. All right, those are your last words. Writer Oscar Wilde died in 1900. And he said this, "Either that wallpaper goes or I go." The wallpaper apparently stayed. Dominique Bourgois, he was a French grammarian. Now, I find that funny because French people talk backwards. I took French in elementary, middle school, and high school, and the French people talk backwards. Go throw that one out there. So, to me, a French grammarian is funny. But this is his last words. He says, "I am about to, or I am going to die." Either expression is correct. Union General John Sedgwick died in battle during the Civil War in 1864, saying these very words. Let me make sure I get this one right. "They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance." I agree with the story on that. And they were in the middle of this big, huge battle, and he was kind of on the front lines, getting cannons in the right place and everything. And there were Confederate snipers in the trees about 1,000 yards away, and bullets are whizzing by, and all of his guys they're trying to run. And he's like, "Where are you running from? They can't hit you." And then he said, "They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance." And then he got shot. And then Robert Erskine's Childers. He was an Irish writer who was executed by a firing squad in 1922. Before his execution, he went around and he shook every man's hand that was on the firing squad. And then he said this to them: take 1 or 2 steps forward, lads. It'll make it a little bit easier. So these famous last words of these people, and we could probably think of so many other different things that people have said over the course of their lives. And it might not have been their actual last words, the words that they said on their deathbed. Maybe it was something that was said to you. Maybe it was something that you've heard that has stuck with you over the course of your life, because that was the last thing that you heard that person say. And what I want us to do this morning is we recognize our graduating seniors. I want us to look at 2 Timothy, a portion of 2 Timothy, because these are Paul's last words. This is Paul's last letter. Paul is sitting in the Mamertine prison in Rome, a prison where he was basically sitting in a dungeon, a cave, below a building. And there was a hole in the ceiling or in the ground. It was just a hole small enough just to let just a little bit of light through for all of the prisoners. And so he's sitting there waiting for his execution, waiting to be killed for his faith. And what does he do? But he sits down and he writes his last words to Timothy. And the reason why is because Paul loves Timothy. He has devoted his life, has devoted his ministry, has devoted his time to pouring into, to mentoring, to discipling Timothy. So he wants to give Timothy his last words. And so we're going to look at a portion of this. And the reason why is well, there's a couple things. As I was kind of trying to figure out what God would have me to speak this morning, I had this plan last week that I'm going to preach this passage, and this is what we're going to talk about. And then Monday morning, I'm sitting there and I'm having my quiet time, and I've been studying through 1 Timothy. And so I was flipping through this other Bible that I'm going to give to Jack when he turns 16. And in this Bible, it's the Bible that I have my quiet time in, that I study in when I'm preparing to preach. And so that's got all my notes. And sometimes I write little notes at him. And so I was on my way to 1 Timothy. And I had passed it up, so I was going back. And I landed on a page that looked just like this. I just have wider margins in the Bible, with a little note that I had written to Jack. And the notice basically says this: Jack, there have been so many people that have poured into you over the course of your life. Now, Randy, he's 2 at this point, but there are people that love him, and I'm hoping over the next 14 years, there are people that pour into his life and minister to him and teach him and help mold and shape him over the course of his life, including myself. And at the end of the little note that I want him to read when he turns 16, it just simply says this: I hope that you have followed the pattern of sound doctrine that you have been taught. That you will love God with everything that you are and everything you had. And so as I was coming across that Monday morning, sitting on my couch as my child slept in the net, well, he was probably wiping poop all over the place, but he does that. I'm not just playing. But I was reading that, and I was just sitting there thinking about these students. And maybe today these are the last words that I get to speak into their lives. Maybe today these are the last words that they'll maybe hear. I'm hoping they hear it. But what I want us to do and understand is it's not just about these students today, because the final words of Paul to Timothy speak to each and every one of us this morning. So what I want us to do is I want us to look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 3. Let's start with, Paul says this to Timothy: I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience. As I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, the faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and of self-control. And so let's stop right there and process what Paul is driving at. Now, as I'm reading this passage of Scripture and I'm preparing it, I go back to an article that I read a while back. And in this article, they're talking about iron. That an iron bar, just a little simple iron bar, it's worth about $5. But you put this iron bar in the hands of the right person, and the person can take that iron bar and they can turn it into a horseshoe. And a horseshoe is worth about $11. Or you can give it to them and they can to somebody else, and they can turn it into a screwdriver. And the screwdriver is worth about $15, right? But then you give it to the right person, and they can take that iron bar and they can turn it into needles that people can use to give themselves shots, or the doctor, the hospital, the nurse, whoever can give them a shot. And that iron bar that was worth $5 is now worth $3,500. Put into the right hands of the right person, this iron bar turns into so much more. What I'm driving at, and what I believe in a way that Paul is driving at here is this, is Timothy, as I write this letter to you, I'm reminded of the people that have poured into your life. I'm reminded of the people who have helped mold and shape you spiritually. And so I think of these students, and I think of, for some of them, the 5 years that I've been with them. For some of them, the couple years that I've been with them. And I think of the things that I hope that they've learned over the course of their time. And I hope that it sticks, because let's just get completely honest. About 70% of students, when they graduate high school, they walk away from the church, they walk away from the faith. And so you hope and pray that it sticks at some point, at some level. I've had students that have walked away from the church, that have walked away from faith, and about 5 years down the road, they come back home, they come back to church, and they're discipling their children, and they're teaching their children to know and love God. And so those are those things that kind of well up within your heart and bring joy to you in the hard days. But what I want us to see is, as we walk through this passage of Scripture again, verses 3 through 7, what we see first and foremost is Paul just kind of reminding Timothy, these are the people that have poured into you. So let's go back and look. Paul says in verse 3, I thank God whom I serve as with my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. And so the first person that Paul kind of draws Timothy's attention to, that has influenced and shaped his life, is Paul himself. We know, if we know anything about Paul and Paul's ministry, we know that Paul poured, and I said it earlier, Paul poured his life, his heart into Timothy to mold him, to shape him, to disciple him. Paul actually views Timothy as his spiritual child, 1 Corinthians 4:14 to 17. If you go back to verse 2 of this chapter, you see, to Timothy, my beloved child. You see in Philippians chapter 2, verses 20 and 22, Paul says this to the Philippians about Timothy. He says, For I have none like him who will be, For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. And so we look at the life of Timothy, how Timothy was molded and shaped by Paul. Again, he had journeyed with him, he had ministered with him, he had cried with him. You see in that passage of Scripture, as I remember your tears, as I pray for you night and day. He's probably thinking of the times that he's prayed with him, that he's prayed for him, the times that they've grieved together, the times that they've celebrated together. There are all these good memories. There are also hard memories for Paul as he thinks of Timothy, as he thinks about his tears. But what he thinks of is the devotion that he's given to Timothy, the things that he's taught Timothy. And so as I think of these students, not just our graduating seniors, but the students that I've worked with for the past 17 years of my life, wow. I think of the simple reality that I've poured my heart, I've poured my life into them. I've hopefully taken Scripture and poured it into their life that will mold them and shape them and help them. Now here's the thing. I'm not just talking about students, because each and every one of us hopefully have had a Paul in our life. Someone who has discipled us, someone who has mentored us, someone who has walked with us through some of the most difficult, trying times. And so as we start this morning, as we dive into Scripture, think about that person. Who is that person that God has blessed you with? And then that's the thing we need to understand. Who is it that God has blessed you with? And then we in turn give Him praise for what God has done. For the people that have been in our lives. Maybe it's been a pastor. Maybe it's been a youth minister. Maybe it's been a Sunday school teacher. Maybe it's been whoever it's been in your life. Who has been there through some of the darkest, most loneliest, trying times, in some of the most joyful times? Who has been there to walk with you, to disciple you, to point you towards Jesus Christ? And that's what Paul did for Timothy. He's reminding Timothy of the things that he's taught him. He's reminding Timothy. Paul's encouraged Timothy to use his gifts that God has given him to live out his calling. Paul has urged Timothy to pursue godliness, endurance, love, and other Christ-like qualities. Paul coached Timothy on how he should respond to people appropriately, how he should study the Word diligently, preach the Word faithfully, and do the work of an evangelist constantly. So who has been the Paul to your Timothy? Who has poured into your life and helped to point you towards Christ-likeness? So then the other side of that coin is this. Who are you being a Paul to? Who is your Timothy? Who are you discipling? Who are you mentoring? Here's the thing with discipleship. Discipleship is not we talk about discipleship a lot. Discipleship is not a class. It's not a meeting. Discipleship is life on life. It's walking together. It's having conversations. And yes, it's about conversations about Scripture, and sometimes it does happen in the classroom setting. But true discipleship that really molds and shapes and forms, just like a Paul-Timothy relationship, is that one-on-one relationship. Paul and Timothy journeyed all over that area, ministering to people, preaching the gospel, sharing with life with one another, sharing meals with one another, crying together, celebrating together, praying together. They did life together. And so who is it that you have pulled alongside of yourself that you are mentoring? Or who is it that has mentored you? And so we see that's the first person that molded and shaped Timothy's life that Paul wants to remind him of. And then ultimately what Paul's doing is he's just reminding Timothy, this is how blessed you are. You've been blessed with me. And so I say that to our students, you've been blessed with me. And they're like, yeah, maybe not. Verse 5, he goes on and he says this, I'm reminded of your sincere faith. A faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. And now, I'm sure, dwells in you as well. And so the next influencer, shaper, molder in Timothy's life was his family. Most notably, his grandmother and his mother. Now, you look at Timothy's life, and we don't really know a whole lot about it, but what we do know is that Timothy's mother, Eunice, had actually married a man who was Greek. He was not of the Jewish faith. His mother was. And so Timothy was called, or is what was called a mumser. He was this half-breed. He didn't belong to the Jewish faith, but he didn't belong to any other Greek faith. And so he wasn't circumcised. He was kind of in the middle. And so he grew up in this very weird, awkward place in his life. And that's part of the reason I believe that Paul stepped into his life to be that father role. But what we ultimately see, though, in this passage of Scripture is that God blessed Timothy with a grandmother and a mother who loved him and who loved the Lord. Now, we don't know when Lois and Eunice came to faith. There's some commentators, most commentators that I was able to read, agreed that they actually came to faith. Maybe even Timothy came to faith during Paul's missionary trip through their hometown of Lystra.